What's going on, everybody? Cleopus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Motorola Moto G Power 5G and the Blue Bold N2. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about either phone individually, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about each of them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Moto G Power 5G, we're getting a 6.5-inch 120Hz IPS LCD display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 405, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. With the Blue Bold N2, we're getting a 6.6-inch AMOLED display with a 1080p resolution as well, a PPI of 390, and a 19.5:9 aspect ratio. So in general, both phones here have really good displays. So if you're doing stuff like watching videos, looking at photos, playing games, or using a social media platform like Instagram, for example, where you want the image itself to look a bit nicer, you're really not going to go wrong with either phone here. That being said though, the Blue Bold N2 does have a slight advantage, first of all being a tiny bit larger at 6.6 inches versus 6.5 with the Moto G Power 5G. And while this difference of course is really not huge, it is still there. And in addition to this, I would say the Blue Bold N2 in general has slightly better display technology with an AMOLED versus an IPS LCD. Now, of course, that's not to say an IPS LCD is bad, because in general, most phones in this price range do have IPS LCD displays, and there's really nothing wrong with that. But with the Blue Bold N2, the AMOLED is going to give it slightly more vibrant colors. It's also going to be a bit brighter, and as you can see here, the viewing angles are significantly better. So with the Blue Bold N2, if you're outside in the sun, for example, or really in any kind of bright area, it is going to be a bit easier to see. So again, in general, while both phones do have really good displays, if you do want the better one between the two, the Blue Bold N2 will have an advantage. Now for storage, both phones have 256GB of internal storage, but with the Moto G Power 5G, we're also getting microSD card expansion, whereas with the Blue Bold N2, unfortunately, this phone does not have microSD card expansion. Now this is really weird because when it comes to phones that don't have microSD card expansion, pretty much the only phones like this are flagship phones or maybe an iPhone, which technically is a flagship phone anyway. So in general, I feel like this is a bit of a drawback, but at the same time, 256GB is really a lot of storage. So while I do wish this phone did have microSD card expansion, for the average user, because it has so much internal storage, you should still at least be okay. But if maybe you take a lot of photos and videos and you do think you're going to need even more space, or maybe your current phone already has a microSD card in it and you just don't want to deal with transferring your stuff to a phone that can't use one, then in that case, the Moto G Power 5G will have an advantage. But one other thing I do want to point out here is that with the Moto G Power 5G, this phone in my hand is factory unlocked, and while I haven't personally seen it being offered by a US carrier yet, I feel like eventually it will be, and if you do end up getting this phone from a US carrier, the storage might be different. But again, for the purpose of this video, especially considering the Blue Bold N2 is a phone you can only get unlocked, the Moto G Power 5G in my hand is factory unlocked, and again, it does have 256GB of internal storage. Now for security features, both phones have Face Unlock, and they both have fingerprint scanners too. With the Moto G Power 5G, it's right here on the power key, and with the Blue Bold N2, it's in the display. But starting with the Moto G Power 5G, let's give them a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And now for the Blue Bold N2. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, remember, both phones have Face Unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. For the camera setups, with the Moto G Power 5G, up front, we get a 16MP selfie camera, then on the back, we get a triple camera setup, with a 50MP main camera, a 2MP macro camera, and a 2MP depth sensing camera. With the Blue Bold N2, up front, we get another 16MP selfie camera, then on the back, we get a quad camera setup, with the 64MP main camera, a 5MP ultra-wide camera, a 2MP macro camera, and a 2MP depth sensing camera. And then for video, with the Moto G Power 5G, this phone has a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, and with the Blue Bold N2, this phone can record 2K videos in the rear camera and 1080p in the front. So unfortunately, neither phone here can record 4K videos, but considering they are more affordable devices, I'm not really that surprised. But if you do happen to want to record 2K videos with the Blue Bold N2, you can at least do that. But as far as the other features here go, the camera setups are pretty similar, but again, with the Blue Bold N2, we do get an ultra-wide camera, whereas unfortunately, with the Moto G Power 5G, despite at least having a macro camera, we don't get an ultra-wide camera here, so if you want to get those wider angle photos, the Blue Bold N2 will have an advantage. Now to give you an idea of what the photo quality is like, here's some pictures taken with the Moto G Power 5G. Overall, considering it is more of an affordable device, I do think the photo quality here is pretty good. For the average user, if you're maybe taking the occasional Instagram photo every now and then, and maybe using Snapchat or sending photos to friends and family, or maybe taking like vacation photos for your own memories, for that kind of use, I do think the camera we're getting here is plenty good enough. And this really just goes to show, for the average casual user, you don't need to go spend $1,000 on a much higher end device. You can easily get a more affordable phone like this, and it will get the job done just fine. And then here's some pictures taken with the Blue Bolt N2. When it comes to which one has better quality between the two, I'm gonna let you decide that for yourself, because after all, the photos are right here. But in general, I do think this phone has pretty good photo quality too. So again, if you're taking photos for more casual personal use, then while of course a more expensive phone is gonna take much better photos, for what they are, I do think both phones here do take really good photos. Now for the RAM and processor, with the Moto G Power 5G, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 930 processor. With the Blue Bolt N2, this phone has 8GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 810. Now when it comes to performance, on one hand between the two, I would say the Moto G Power 5G is the faster device here, but that being said, the Blue Bolt N2 is really not far behind. So in general, if you're looking for a phone that has decent performance for more basic tasks, stuff like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and maybe some light mobile gaming, either phone will get the job done just fine. But again, if you want the faster phone between the two, the Moto G Power 5G will have an advantage. And one other thing I do want to point out here is that with the Blue Bolt N2, despite not having 5G in the name, this is still a 5G phone, so if you are looking for 5G connectivity, you're not going to have to worry about that here. Now I did run a benchmark test on each phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. So again, as you can see here, the Moto G Power 5G again does have an advantage, so if you do want the faster phone here, definitely keep this in mind, but again the difference is really not huge, so in general for average daily use, the Blue Bolt N2 will still be perfectly fine. Now for the batteries, with the Moto G Power 5G, we're getting a 5000 mAh battery that supports 15W fast charging, and with the Blue Bolt N2, we're getting a 4200 mAh battery that supports 30W fast charging. So clearly here, there are some differences. On one hand, with the Moto G Power 5G, having a larger battery, you are going to get better battery life and longevity with this phone, but on the other hand, with the Blue Bolt N2, having 30W fast charging versus 15, the charging speed is going to be a bit better. Now in general, I feel like having a better battery is just better value overall, but if for some reason charging speed is more important to you, then I guess the Blue Bolt N2 will have an advantage there. Now for the software, with the Moto G Power 5G, we are getting Android 13, whereas unfortunately with the Blue Bolt N2, this phone only has Android 11. And honestly at this point in 2023, seeing as we're halfway through the year, so we're what, 6 months away from Android 14 coming out, this phone having Android 11 is definitely a drawback, and considering Blue's software support is like notoriously bad, I doubt this phone is going to be getting any kind of major updates. So definitely if you care about the software, the Motorola will have a huge advantage. When it comes to other features, unfortunately neither phone here has NFC, so if you like to use tap and pay, you are going to want to get something else entirely. But also keep in mind, with the Moto G Power 5G, we are getting a headphone jack here, whereas unfortunately the Blue Bolt N2 doesn't have a headphone jack. So if you have a normal pair of wired headphones you want to use, then between the two, the Moto G Power 5G will have an advantage. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, I feel like in pretty much every way, the Moto G Power 5G is the better device here. Sure, on one hand, the Blue Bolt N2 does have a couple advantages, like, again, we are getting an ultra-wide camera here. It can also record 2K videos in the rear camera. The AMOLED display technology also gives the Blue Bolt N2 a slightly nicer looking image. And again, this phone does have 30W fast charging, which is pretty impressive. But this phone is also missing a lot of really basic features like NFC. Granted, the Motorola doesn't have it either, but with the Blue Bolt N2, I feel like they really tried to position this as more of a premium device. So not having NFC is definitely disappointing. And it also again doesn't have a headphone jack, and it doesn't even have microSD card expansion, which if this were a much higher end device, then I guess I would understand, but this phone is under $300, and again, honestly for what it is, or at least what Blue was trying to make it look like, it's really just not that impressive. On the other hand, with the Moto G Power 5G, despite not having an AMOLED display, we are still getting a really nice image here. This phone also does have a pretty good camera too, and again, this phone has a much larger battery, slightly better performance, and a much newer version of Android. So in general, between the two, while the Blue Bolt N2 is really not a terrible phone, I feel like in pretty much any situation, the Motorola Moto G Power 5G is a much better choice. Now again, if you want to learn more about either phone individually, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.